Hello, welcome back to Tianjin. I'm delighted to be welcomed by Sam, is it Geall? Yeah, Sam Geall from China Dialogue. Sam's been living here in Beijing for a while now and reporting for the China Dialogue website. Perhaps that's a nice place for us to start. You could introduce the website to our viewers because it's worth knowing about, Sam.
Thank you very much. Well, China Dialogue is what we like to call the world's, only first fully bilingual website on the environment. It's in Chinese and English. It's fully bilingual, which means the everything from the articles, the blog posts, podcasts to users' comments are translated. So the idea is to get a conversation between experts, intellectuals, concerned citizens, or ordinary people, and their Chinese counterparts going across the language barrier to try and look for some kind of shared constructive space in which to discuss issues like climate change.
There's a lot of interesting stuff on the website, and I guess China inherently faces such huge challenges when it comes to climate change and the environment. And the smog here in Tianjin, you tell me that this isn't particularly bad, but I think a lot of the visitors here have been quite shocked by it. What are the big challenges that China faces?
Well, if we look at the smog, as a starting point, this is one indication of the kinds of pervasive, direct environmental sort of pollution problems that exist in China. So we're not just talking about the long-term, climate warming and so on that Copenhagen, that the UNFCCC process sort of focuses on. Ordinary people are really facing water pollution challenges, water scarcity, soil contamination, very pervasive air pollution, not only in the cities but even in the countryside where you have a lot of rural industry. There's really an environmental health crisis happening. But this is, not unrelated to the climate change challenge. What's interesting is that there are a lot of kind of win-wins that you can find really by linking together these challenges. So, for instance, energy efficiency and reducing emissions does reduce urban air pollution as well as helping to mitigate greenhouse gas.
You mentioned these win-wins, and that's something that we've kind of heard a lot of here in China, a real big emphasis on the green economy and the potential for China to be a leader in terms of renewables and massive investment here in wind power and solar as well, I believe. These represent relatively kind of obvious kind of platforms for action, I guess. Is this something that's being picked up within China? Is there enthusiasm not only in the business community but across the broader sector of society for kind of engaging with climate change as an issue?
Well, there's a very famous Chinese economist called Huang Gang, who was really one of the architects of China's reform and opening up in the late 70s and early 1980s. And he continues to, be a very influential voice in policy circles, particularly with, regard to sort of China's economic path. And his view of history, as it pans out, is that there have so far been three revolutions in the past sort of 300 years, and that there's one more happening now. And the three revolutions were the Industrial Revolution, which started in Britain and started this whole sort of process of growth, which of course has led to the carbon emissions we have today. The economic reforms that were introduced in the late 70s and early 1980s in China, which unleashed this huge entrepreneurialism and this rapid economic growth. The IT revolution in the late 1990s, in the early 1990s, which China didn't join because of its sort of political retrenchment at the time, and now the low carbon revolution, which he is convinced that China can be at the forefront of and can really use to spur its growth into the future and to maintain a kind of long-term sustainable growth. So yes, this is actually quite a popular opinion, and there's a real political will to kind of embrace those low carbon development goals and that kind of pathway, and there's a lot of public support for that. The difficulty is then in how do you implement that without losing out in the short term, and those are the kinds of debates that I'm sure are happening now in the research institutes and in the government institutions, in the elites in China.
And you mentioned these kind of these win-wins and the hope for China kind of leading the green economic revolution. It's kind of an interesting contrast to the UK and US and the West, where often climate change kind of regulation or the response to climate change is seen as a real threat to business and industry. I know that China, there has been a certain amount of controversy about factories being closed down in order to meet the kind of emissions targets and stuff as well. So it sounds like the Chinese government are imposing some pretty stern measures. Is that your impression of things from living here?
When you get into the details of implementing laws in China, it often gets quite complicated. So what you find is that while China is not only signatory to all these international treaties, but also has very impressive very impressive environmental laws on its books, their implementation is often patchy, and there's a structural issue at work about the way that the provinces relate to the central government. And so what you often find is provinces kind of having to play catch up very quickly, and so suddenly introducing rather counterproductive, very draconian measures very quickly, not really working out how to implement these things. The central government swooping in. You get these slightly confusing kind of situations coming out. But there is broad support, I think, in the business community for some kind of stable transition towards a low carbon economy.
I just want to ask you a little bit about kind of public engagement with this issue. Is it something that kind of people broadly accept? Is there a lot of activism around climate change? The impression that you get from being here is that people are increasingly aware of it, but we certainly don't have people out on the streets protesting about it. But there is a kind of growing awareness and consensus that climate change is a problem. And I think the difference here seems to be, from my impression, that the people are witnessing the effects of climate change and kind of attributing that to climate change. Is that the case? Is it that the people are seeing the results and that's why they're starting to understand climate change, or is it kind of a government-led initiative that the government has decided that they're going to inform people about climate change and the people have followed?
Well, there's been an environmental movement in China really since the 90s. People have been focused on issues like water pollution and dam building and large infrastructure projects and things like this for a long time. When we started China Dialogue in 2006, there still was very little discussion about climate change. There was very little public engagement with this topic, and understandably, it seemed like a far more kind of nebulous, long-term, and rather uncertain kind of area. But really, in that time, it started with the release of the IPCC, the first IPCC assessment report in 2007 on the physical science basis of climate change that really looked at the scientific consensus that exists around sort of climate change's impact on food, energy and water systems and the kinds of things this would mean for our societies. And that really got a lot of coverage. So when you're talking about where the government fits in creating public awareness around this, it is true that the government media and the state media really played a role actually in bringing awareness to this particular report. But that then really moved into the public sphere, and since then, there's been a lot more engagement, a lot of discussion about these things. Soon after that, there were big snowstorms in Beijing, really kind of a freak weather event, and a lot of people started discussing, so how does this fit with the kinds of projections we're seeing of kind of an increased frequency of these sort of extreme weather events. And people are having quite serious scientifically based discussions about this in the media, and as people do, ordinary people were really reflecting on this and saying, what kinds of changes have I seen, what does this mean for me, and what will it mean in the future? There was a report recently by Chinese scientists that looked at likely impacts of a warmer climate on agriculture and found potentially very significant negative impacts on water and food security. Particularly on grain, which is the main crop in northern China, which has been facing its record droughts in the last few years, as has southwest China for that matter. So the combination of these issues, along with increased environmental awareness around the Beijing Olympics, along with the kinds of discussions that happened during the global financial crisis as well, when people started saying, so how do we get out of this recession? Can we have a Green New Deal? And that discussion was happening in China as well. People were thinking about the kinds of green jobs plans you could have. Jiang Gaoming, who's a columnist for China Dialogue and a sort of quite a well-known environmentalist in China, was looking at how you could convert rural vehicles that are used for short trips around the countryside to battery power, and the kinds of win-wins you could get. The kinds of green jobs, reduction of rural air pollution at the same time as mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. These kinds of strategies really started to come to the fore.
So just to end with then, what's the trajectory that China's on as far as you're concerned? Because one of the things that really hits you when you arrive here is that in the cities and these modern developed areas, the scale of development is just huge. Whether it's this conference centre, which is unbelievably massive, or you don't drive past a tower block here, you drive past kind of 23 tower blocks lined up in a row, each of them kind of shiny and new, and so whatever China decides to do, it's going to be massive, I get the impression. But are we on a path where they're going to increasingly consume more of everything, more resources, more fossil fuels, more input, or are we genuinely seeing the potential to shape society in a way which is going to be fundamentally different to the development trajectories that we've seen in the West in the past, something that's kind of greener, more efficient, and focused more on social good?
Well, the question, one way of looking at the question is to say, does China really have an option to continue with a fossil fuel-based, industrial path? There's quite a compelling argument to say ultimately it doesn't. The growth of economies, in the West has largely been based on a paradigm of pollute first and clean up later, and of offshoring your emissions to other countries. So Europe has really been able to develop at the expense of poorer countries. China doesn't really have that option anymore. It has that option to a limited extent by offshoring its pollution within its own country, by pushing its factories away from the eastern seaboard towards poorer regions, and thus kind of spreading the risk towards those regions. But it doesn't really have much way to really clean up otherwise. So really China doesn't have that much alternative except to try and make itself into a hub for green innovation. I think that's really its only way forward.
That's quite an optimistic and positive note to leave it on in a way, if we can hope cautiously optimistic, and nice of you to add that. Thanks very much for joining us, Sam, and I'll hand back over to the UK studio, and I'm sure you'll be joining us again soon to speak to our next guest.